So one of the things that's become abundantly clear in the past 10 to 20 years, though there were beginning to be really good understandings of it even before that, is that environmental chemical exposures are increasingly being linked to a whole host of what are now common, widespread chronic diseases and health disorders. And I'll just list them in no particular order. Diabetes, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, obesity, developmental, reproductive, and neurological disorders, behavioral and learning problems, allergies, and increased risk for certain cancers. All of these are increasingly being linked to environmental chemical exposures. Doesn't necessarily mean that a specific exposure caused a particular disease, but they set the stage and increase the susceptibility and vulnerability and likelihood that more people may develop these conditions. And as we all know, those diseases are now, and health disorders are now kind of rampant and epidemic among just the world population. One of the other things that's become abundantly clear is that one of the times in life that is most crucial for these exposures in terms of how they may end up affecting human health is exposure at very early stages of life. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But in addition to those kind of chemical exposures that are now being linked in all sorts of scientific studies with animals and with human cells to specific disease outcomes, it's also become increasingly understood that environmental pollutants and stressors, things like pollution, air pollution from tailpipe emissions, vehicular pollution, also poor nutrition, domestic stress and community violence, those kind of environmental stressors can actually be contributors to physiological conditions that can increase an individual's vulnerability to both infectious diseases and the kind of effects that chemicals can cause. And in fact, there are quite a number of studies now, for example, with children who are exposed to both lead and also to traffic pollution or some kind of psychological stress that produces chemical responses within the body that can exacerbate how the chemicals then interact with cells. So we're learning more and more about how the environment can affect how cells and how the working of the human body behaves. There are a few other things that I want to try to pinpoint, and if I was a slide maker, I would have kind of a timeline where there might be some pinpoints where there were sort of growing bunches of information that started to really change how we understand environmental health. Since the 1950s, if not earlier, probably much, much earlier, scientists and health professionals have truly been aware and known quite a lot about the potential adverse health impacts of lots of different chemicals that are used, particularly in industry and manufacturing. Things like pesticides and sort of hydrocarbon chemistry and things used in heavy industry. And even longer ago than that, for centuries, people have been aware about the toxic and hazardous effects of heavy metals, things like lead and mercury. So the idea that being exposed to a chemical environmentally could make you sick, that's not new. But historically, what was focused on were severe, acute, immediate reactions, something that might immediately impact your ability to breathe, or something that might have a really dramatic impact on your nervous system, or some kind of skin reaction. A little bit later on, people started focusing on really dramatic adverse health effects like birth defects or certain unusual cancers. These were all acute, rare, unusual, big effects. And those, to a large extent, are the types of health effects that our chemical regulatory system was designed to address. As one scientist I've talked to whose work is really interesting, and if you ever get a chance to hear Terry Collins from Carnegie Mellon speak, I really encourage you to do that. He's absolutely fascinating. And as he said to me once, and I'm sure he said this in his lectures, we've gotten good at stopping people from dropping dead on the factory floor. And yeah, we actually have, that doesn't happen so much anymore, thank goodness. We've also done a pretty good job, or a lot better job than we did back in the 1960s and 70s before our big environmental laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act were enacted, at addressing really big industrial sources of pollution. Things that come out of smokestacks and drain pipes and nasty toxic waste drums that get dumped somewhere. That's the kind of really big industrial pollution that people had been focused on 30, 40 years ago. What we've learned since then, particularly since the late 1980s, certainly throughout the 90s and the past 10 to 15 years, is that in addition to those big industrial sources, we are now surrounded with chemicals that are in finished products, and that those chemicals are actually emerging from those finished products while they're being used as they're intended to. So you don't have to wait until the thing is broken or it's discarded or it's in a dump to have chemicals leaching out of plastics, out of textiles that have things in their coatings or that have been put into upholstery foam. These chemicals are coming out and ending up in indoor air, in household dust. And if you could picture a really big change in the landscape of how we understand sources of chemicals. In the 1960s and 70s and earlier, the focus was, if you draw a map, sort of a smokestack here, a drain pipe here, and yes, the stuff was getting into the environment and affecting people in the immediate vicinity, and eventually it would move out. But now we're also dealing with all these little tiny sources that are with us all the time, literally these days since before birth. And this radically changes how you need to start thinking about the solutions, because you can think about reducing the smokestack emissions. You can put a scrubber on them. Ideally, you don't send the toxics out of the smokestack at all, but there are ways you can try and sort of put something on the end of the pipe, so to speak. But when it comes to a piece of upholstery or a piece of plastic that's in an electronic appliance or your child's baby bottle or your drinking cup, you can't put a scrubber on that. You can't somehow put something on the end of that pipe. You just have to think about that entirely differently, and that's where the green chemistry design for the environment comes in. So big change in thinking about sources. Another thing to keep in mind, and I think Dr. Clement alluded to this, is that one of the things we also have to deal with is the fact that a lot of the chemicals that are being used in products and manufacturing processes are designed to last a really long time. They're what's called persistent. They don't break down easily in the environment. And some of them can last literally for decades. Things like PCBs that I'm sure some of you have heard of, they haven't been used commercially since the 1970s, but they're still being found everywhere. They were used as insulating fluids and electronics. And they're just these really persistent molecules. Same thing for pesticides like DDT. And it turns out there are lots of other things that have been widely used, like the flame retardants I'm sure many of you have read about that are used in upholstery foam and plastics. They have molecules that are designed to last. Same thing with the waterproofing compounds and the stain-resistant compounds, the things that make nonstick pans and things like that, designed to last a really long time. So there are any number of these chemicals that once they get into household dust, they get into the adjacent air, they can end up going down a drain. They move around the world. You can't see them. Dr. Clement, and Stephen Shore said these are these invisible things, but they're moving around all the time. And so now scientists are finding some of these chemicals halfway around the world from where they were ever used. And I started reading these studies and was just absolutely perplexed and fascinated as to how chemicals that are used to make frying pans resist sticky food or to make a couch cushion not burst into flame, they're ending up in polar bears, they're ending up in sea turtles, they're ending up in seals. I mean, why are these things moving around the world? So you've got some of these things that last a really long time. There are other chemicals, some of the things that you also may have heard of, like bisphenol A, that makes up polycarbonate plastic, that has gotten more than its fair share of press recently, and chemicals that are called, there's a whole class of chemicals with a funny name called phthalates, PHTHALATES, and they have lots and lots of uses, one of which is to make polyvinyl chloride, PVC plastic, flexible. Without them, it would be kind of brittle. They also are used to make synthetic fragrances last longer. They're in personal care products. They're just used in a lot of things. And those kind of chemicals, things like BPA, they don't last a long time in the environment. In fact, they break down pretty quickly, but they're so widely used that scientists consider them, our exposure to them, virtually continuous or continual, and that the exposure is ubiquitous. So we have this combination we're surrounded with now, that there are chemicals that last a long time. There's some that don't last so long, but we're continually being exposed to them because, frankly, they're kind of in everything. They're really hard to avoid. So we have all these different sources. We have things that last a long time. We have things that are just everywhere. And another one of the huge things that's changed is how we understand where these chemicals are ending up and how they're interacting with living cells. And just a couple other things I want to remember to say about the numbers of these chemicals. And this can all be kind of overwhelming, and I don't want anybody to, just feel I have to duck under their seats, but there are tens of thousands of these chemicals that are used. A number that gets thrown out in the United States about the number of chemicals registered for in commerce is more than 80,000. It's hard to know exactly how many are in use at any time, but there are lots and lots of them, and more are being invented every day. And now, regularly, every few years, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, does a survey. It's called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, NHANES, N-H-A-N-E-S for short. And they are testing a wide cross-section of Americans for the presence of now over 200 industrial chemicals in blood and urine samples. And they're finding that the majority of Americans tested have great numbers of these chemicals in their system. And there have also been quite a number of studies done now testing newborns' umbilical cord blood, and several of these studies have turned up over 200 synthetic industrial chemicals in newborns' blood. And that's, I think, a really strong signal of how extremely pervasive this exposure is, because those babies haven't been around very long, and the idea that those chemicals have gone all the way through their mothers' bodies and ended up in them at birth, I just find very, very striking. So on this list of sort of game-changing things that we've learned in the past 10 to 20 years, the sources, the number of chemicals, how they last, how they move around the world. And one of the really big things that we've learned is about timing of exposure, how the chemicals interact with living cells, and the kinds of subtle effects it can create. And I've mentioned before that early life turns out to be a really, really important time for setting the stage for health throughout life. And indeed, it seems to be pretty much a consensus in the world of environmental health science that early life exposure to environmental contaminants can indeed set the stage for any number of adult diseases. And the tricky thing about all of this is that not everybody who is exposed to a chemical will ever show any signs of any illness that might be associated with this. And it may take years for any effects to show up, so it's always really tricky to prove cause and effect, which is one of the many challenges we have in trying to craft policy to address these things. And the other thing that complicates all this is that each of us has very distinct and individual chemistry, so how one person's body may respond to a chemical exposure very likely will not be identical to somebody else's. But one thing that is now widely accepted is that timing of exposure is really, really important. And again, that early life stage is considered one of the most vulnerable and susceptible. And in fact, in the past several years, a number of major professional medical associations have come out with policy statements. The American Medical Association, American Nurses Association, American Public Health Association, among others, have all made policy statements, and they're quite easy to find online, saying that to improve public health, one of the things we need to do is to reduce, if not eliminate, exposure to this type of environmental chemical that can particularly interact with children's, newborns, infants' hormones, particularly endocrine hormones. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I think that's really important to understand, that this scientific sort of consensus is out there. Another thing that's happened recently in that realm is a few years ago, scientific societies that represent more than 40,000 scientists wrote a letter, an open letter, to the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, calling for more research into this kind of chemical exposure because they think it's so important to really understand. So I just mentioned hormones and endocrine hormones. How many here have heard of or are familiar with the concept of endocrine disruptors? Yeah, quite a lot of people. Well, that's another one of the really big game changers, because one of the things that people started sort of homing in on in the late 1980s throughout the 1990s, and it really got put on the map in the mid-1990s, is that a huge number of synthetic industrial chemicals have structures and shapes and chemical compositions that enable them to interfere with or disrupt or even mimic the workings of the endocrine hormones, which are absolutely essential for maintaining all sorts of healthy body systems. And we now understand that endocrine hormones are part of maintaining not only healthy metabolism that most people are familiar with and reproduction and development, but also important for cardiovascular health and some immune system functions, and also for neurological and cognitive function. So because these chemicals can interfere with how an endocrine hormone works, it means they can upset the very delicate balance, and it's often described as a feedback loop, of what a hormone at a particular time that it's released in the body sets in motion. And it's also been discovered, and I think it was Dr. Clement who mentioned epigenetics, that these kind of chemicals can change the way genetic material works, and it can get a lot more technical than that. But I think the important thing to understand is that it doesn't make a mutation or a genetic defect. It changes the chemistry in the cell in a way so that the gene essentially doesn't behave the way it's supposed to in a healthy body. And the response of that genetic interaction is so profound that it actually can create a pattern that is passed on to subsequent generations. And there are now a lot of studies out there that are looking at multi-generational, transgenerational chemical exposure, so that the individual who was exposed, she doesn't show any effects, but those show up in her children and her grandchildren. And that, I think, is really, really profound. So we've introduced a changed understanding of a changed landscape of where chemicals are coming from, what kinds and the numbers we're surrounded by, and also the fact that timing of exposure is really, really important. And early life isn't the only vulnerable time. Puberty, other transitions in development are really important, and there's increasing research that well into later life, old age always sounds so bad, but later life is also a really important stage, so that, you know, our bodies don't stop changing, they don't stop developing, the brain doesn't stop working, and chemicals can affect things at all sorts of stages of life. But those early stages when things are happening really fast within a developing body, that's a really key time.